Even before the two Tenryus hit the water, it was obvious they were too small. While barely big enough to act as destroyer squadron leaders, they were obviously not large enough to fill the light cruiser's other role of scout for the battle fleet. Remember, this was effectively before radio. Also remember that while World War I hadn't yet ended, Jutland had been fought the year before, and it had thoroughly demonstrated the need to be able to properly ascertain the enemy's forces and their disposition, then report back. The result was that the 6 follow-on Tenryus were cancelled in a series of 8 5,500 metric ton light cruisers based on the Tenryus that could scout for the battle line and act as destroyer squadron leaders was started. In the event, the last 3 were recast as the first 3 of a new class when a larger 24-inch torpedo became available. Such was the strain on the Japanese economy as a result of its various building programs, though, that only the first 2 could be funded in 1917. The others had to wait until 1918. This started entering service in 1920 as the 5 ships of the 5,000 19-ton Kuma class. Main armament remained the 140mm 50 caliber gun. The number, though, was increased. Many criticized their layout, but I'm not as harsh. Yes, in retrospect it seems odd, but for the time it wasn't that unorthodox. Besides, how many times did a ship actually fire straight off the bow or stern? The larger size and expanded role also meant that torpedo armament grew, even if only by 2 tubes. The downside was that the mounts were now carried on the beams. As a result, the number that could be fired off each side actually went down. Even more on the downside, except for Oi and Kitakami, they never carried the Type 93 long lance. Also, as a result of their effectiveness in World War I, they were fitted with the ability to carry and lay mines. Protection was only minimally improved over their predecessors, it being felt adequate to protect them against destroyers. Propulsion, though, had to be improved. Not only were these ships heavier than the Tenryus, but to fill the scout role, they had to actually be faster. For this reason, they shipped 2 more boilers and grew from 3 to 4 propellers. They initially carried no aircraft. Finally, the forecastle deck was lengthened considerably. Whereas in the Tenryus, it only ran about the forward fourth of their length, in these ships it spanned about 3/4 their length, interrupted only by the cutouts that housed the forward torpedo mounts. This was to keep them dry at the high speeds they were expected to reach. In the early 40s, the decision was made to convert 3 of them into torpedo cruisers in anticipation of what I like to call the Midnight Banzai Charge, the night before the Great Decisive Battle. In the event, though, there was only enough torpedo mounts for 2 of them. Oi and Kitakami were fitted with a massive 40 torpedoes each and attached to the battle line, which did nothing. They never saw action in this role and were eventually converted, yet again, into fast transports. On the whole, I'm pretty surprised at how little these ships did. Kuma was started August 29th, 1918 and completed August 31st, 1920. Tama was started August 10th, 1918 and completed January 29th, 1921. Kitakami was started September 1st, 1919 and completed April 15th, 1921. Oi was started November 24th, 1919 and completed May 4th, 1921. Kiso was started June 19th, 1919 and completed October 3rd, 1921. Main armament was 7 140mm 50 caliber guns in single open-backed, hand-worked mounts. 2 were forward of the bridge, 1 facing forward, and number 2 facing aft. 3 more sat on either side of the bridge. Guns 5 and 6 sat well aft on the center line, just ahead of the rear superstructure. This effectively restricted their firing arcs to off the beams. Mount 7 was fitted center line just aft of the rear superstructure. These were the same guns as on the Tenryus, except that their maximum elevation was raised to 25 degrees, which increased their range to 9.5 miles. Heavy anti-aircraft was 2 76mm 40 caliber guns, 1 on either side of the forward funnel. Torpedo armament was 4 twin 21-inch torpedo tubes, 2 mounts of 2 on each side. 1 pair was mounted in low cutouts between the bridge and the forward funnel. The rear pair were in cubby holes aside and in front of gun 5. These were the Type 6 21-inch torpedo, which had entered service in 1918 on the Tenryus. Weight was 1,432 kilograms. Length was 6.84 meters. Warhead weight was 203 kilograms. Propulsion was kerosene air. Range was 7,000 meters at 35 knots, or 10,000 meters at 32 knots, or 15,000 meters at 26 knots. 48 mines could also be carried. Propulsion was provided by 12 boilers in 4 rooms. The first 2 rooms vented to one funnel, while the other 2 each had their own. The first room had 2 small coal-burning boilers, the second had 4 medium oil burners, the third had 4 large oil burners, and the fourth had 2 small oil burners. These provided steam to the 4 turbines, 2 per room, which produced 90,000 horsepower for a speed of 36 knots. They had 1 rudder. Protection was 63 millimeters of belt that protected the engines. Deck armor was 29 millimeters, increasing to 45 millimeters over the magazines. Conning tower armor was up to 51 millimeters on the sides and 25 millimeters on the roof. Modifications varied, especially once the war started. Between 1932 and 1934, Kuma spent the start of the war through the end of July 1942, covering the invasion and occupation of the Philippines. After a month of refit in Japan, she headed to the East Indies and spent the rest of her life there. On January 11, 1944, while operating northwest of Penang, she was hit in the starboard quarter by 2 torpedoes from the British submarine Tally-Ho. With power knocked out and fires burning, she finally sank stern first just before noon. Tama and Kiso were part of the Northern Force, i.e. the Aleutians, on December 7th. Highlights for 1942 included sailing to try to intercept the Doolittle raid force in April and covering the Aleutian invasion in June. In May of 1943, Tama took part in the Battle of Komandorski, Kiso being in refit at the time. With the Solomons campaign bleeding Japan dry in late September 1943, they ferried troops and supplies to Truk. Off Cape St. George on October 21, 1943, Tama was damaged by a near miss while Kiso was hit by a bomb that sent them back to Japan for repairs and refit. There, they essentially stayed until the 20th of October 1944, when Tama sailed as part of the decoy carrier force. At the Battle of Cape Engano, on the morning of October 25th, Tama was hit by an aircraft torpedo that knocked out her middle boiler room. At about 9 p.m., while retiring northward, the already wounded Tama was hit by 3 torpedoes from the submarine Jaleo. Almost immediately, she jackknifed and sank. Almost right after the battle, Kiso escorted the cargo-laden carrier Junio to the East Indies, then ran supplies to Manila, arriving in mid-November. While in Manila Harbor on November 13, 1944, Kiso was attacked by carrier planes that hit her with 3 bombs. At about 1:30 p.m., Kiso finally sunk in the shallow waters of Manila Harbor. Her wreck was finally refloated and scrapped in 1955. Oe and Kitakami were attached to the battle fleet in home waters on December 7, 1941. With the exception of escorting the Aleutians invasion force in early June, they pretty much did nothing for the first 3 quarters of 1942. Now converted into transport cruisers in mid-September, they ferried troops and supplies around Truk, the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Philippines before returning to Japan at the end of the year. 1943 continued the trend by ferrying people and things around first the Southwest Pacific, then the East Indies and Indian Ocean. While sailing through the Malacca Strait on January 27, 1944, Kitakami was hit by 2 torpedoes from the British submarine Templar. The damage was so bad it wasn't until mid-August, 7 months later, that she finally limped into Japan for repairs. Oe, meanwhile, remained in the East Indies, ferrying things around. South of Hong Kong at 11:11 a.m. on July 19, 1944, she was hit midship by 2 torpedoes from the submarine Flasher. At 5:25 p.m., she finally sank stern first. With repairs and conversion to a chitin carrier completed, but fuel and air cover virtually non-existent, in late January of 1945, Kitakami essentially sat out the rest of the war. The dilapidated ship was finally scrapped in 1946.